In March 1943, beneath the endless Arctic night, a shadow moved through the ice. The sea was black as iron, and the cold felt alive. Somewhere between Greenland and the Norwegian Sea, a German U-boat cut through the freezing water like a silent predator. Its name was U-255, and its mission was one few aboard fully understood. Inside the cramped steel hull, 24 men worked in near darkness. Their breath turned to mist. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and rust. The engine's deep thrum echoed like a heartbeat through the ship. At the captain's station stood Kapitänleutnant Franz Reiner, a man in his early 30s with sharp eyes and a face carved by frost and fatigue. He studied the navigation chart spread before him. The red pencil marks led toward the jagged coast of Greenland, a land almost untouched by war, where icebergs towered like mountains and storms came without warning. He turned to his second officer, Lieutenant Klaus Berger, and said quietly, "Radio silence from now on. We are ghosts from here." Berger nodded. "And the station, sir? Will it be worth all this?" Reiner's gaze didn't move from the map. "Command believes so. A weather outpost here could change everything for the Atlantic convoys. The Allies depend on forecasts from the north. We must beat them at their own game." For months, the German High Command had struggled against Allied air and sea superiority. The battle for weather data, something invisible yet vital, had become a hidden war. If the Germans could predict storms and fog better than the Allies, their U-boats could strike with deadly precision. That was why U-255 carried not torpedoes alone, but crates of radio equipment, meteorological instruments, and a small team of scientists. Their task, to secretly establish a weather station on Greenland's eastern coast. But as they pressed north, the ice closed in. On the third week of their journey, the sound changed. The steady rhythm of the sea became a grinding roar. Ice. The men gathered at the periscope as pale light filtered through cracks in the surface. Giant floes surrounded them, groaning and shifting. "Surface?" asked Berger. Reiner shook his head. "No, we'll be trapped." But the ice had its own plans. The submarine shuddered as a loud crack echoed through the hull. The lights flickered. Men shouted. "Damage report!" Reiner barked. "Pressure hull holding, sir, but we're wedged." The engines strained, propellers churning uselessly. The U-boat creaked like an old tree under snow. For hours they tried everything, ballast shifts, reverse thrust, even manual levering. But the sea had them. Finally, Reiner gave the order no captain wanted to give. "Prepare to abandon ship." The men fell silent. In the freezing dark, they understood what that meant. By dawn, they surfaced through a narrow gap in the ice. The world above was white, endless, and silent. Wind howled over the frozen sea like a living thing. They climbed out one by one, wrapped in heavy coats and wool, their breath steaming. The U-boat's black hull looked like a whale trapped beneath glass. Berger looked around the horizon. Nothing but snow and death. Reiner answered quietly. "Somewhere west of here, there's an Allied station. If we reach it, we survive." They gathered what they could, food, weapons, maps, and the scientific crates, and began their march. The first day's journey was brutal. The cold cut through every layer of clothing. Their boots froze solid when they stopped to rest. The snow was waist-deep in places, and the wind never stopped screaming. They moved in single file, dragging sleds with ropes, their faces hidden behind scarves. The scientists stumbled often, unused to such terrain. By nightfall, they found a patch of rock that offered some shelter from the wind. They lit a small fire using alcohol from their medical kit. The flames flickered weakly, barely warming their hands. Berger spoke softly as they ate hard bread and tinned meat. "How far do you think this station is?" Reiner stared into the fire. 2 days, maybe 3. If the maps are right. And if they're not, then we freeze. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant groan of the ice. The next morning they found the sea behind them, frozen solid. The U-boat was now buried under a growing mountain of ice. Their only link to home was gone. Still they pushed forward. Rainer led the way, compass in hand. Each step was a test of endurance. Their supplies grew lighter, their spirits heavier. At midday, one of the scientists, Dr. Vogel, collapsed. His face was pale blue, lips cracked. They tried to carry him, but he begged them to leave him behind. Rainer refused. No one dies alone here. They built a small snow shelter, gave him the last of their coffee, and waited through the night. By morning, Vogel was gone, his face peaceful, his hands still clutching a notebook filled with weather readings. Rainer tore out the last page and tucked it into his coat. He'll be remembered. By the 5th day, the survivors were down to half rations. The radio batteries were nearly dead. One of the engineers, Hansen, thought he saw smoke on the horizon, a faint column rising through the snow. "Could be the Allied station," he said. "Or a trap," muttered Berger. Rainer looked through his binoculars. The wind made it hard to see, but he caught a glimpse of something. Metal towers, perhaps an antenna. Hope or illusion. He lowered the glasses. "We move at dawn." That night, the wind died down. The stars shone cold and distant, reflected in the frozen plains. The men huddled together in silence. Rainer took out his small journal and wrote by candlelight. "We are adrift in a sea of white. The ice takes our ship, our warmth, our strength, but it will not take our will. Somewhere ahead there is life, and perhaps redemption." He closed the book and looked around at his men. They were asleep, wrapped in blankets, their breath rising in clouds. For the first time since the war began, he wondered whether the mission mattered anymore, whether orders still had meaning in a place where even the ocean could crush steel. But he knew one thing. If they stopped moving, they would never be found. At sunrise, the sky turned pink over the ice fields. The men rose slowly, faces numb, eyes hollow. They gathered what little remained and began their march again, toward the thin smoke on the horizon. Behind them, the wind erased their footprints. Ahead, the frozen world waited, silent and endless. And somewhere beyond that horizon, in a lonely Allied outpost manned by meteorologists and hunters, another small group was watching the same sunrise, unaware that death was walking toward them step by step through the snow. In March 15, 1943, the Arctic winds carried more than snow. They carried war. The eastern coast of Greenland was a place few men dared to live. The world there was made of silence. The silence of snow, of distance, of isolation. But in that silence, hidden among ridges of ice and stone, stood a small wooden outpost with a tall metal antenna. It belonged to the Allies, though no flag flew above it. It was called Station Northlight, a weather and radio post manned by 5 men, 3 Americans and 2 Danish hunters. Their job was simple in words, but brutal in practice. Measure wind, pressure, and temperature. Transmit readings to London every 6 hours. Survive. The station's leader, Lieutenant Samuel Carter, had been there for 6 months. A tall man with calm eyes and a rough beard, he spent most of his time checking the radio logs and writing brief notes in his journal. He once dreamed of being a teacher, now he taught the wind. His small crew was a patchwork of men drawn together by circumstance. There was Dr. Philip Marsh, the radio operator, always with his round glasses fogged up. He missed New York and kept a deck of cards in his pocket, though he rarely played. Erik and Lars Jensen, the Danish brothers, were local hunters who knew the ice better than anyone alive. Their sled dogs were their family, and their rifles were as much tools of survival as defense. And finally, Corporal Tom Riley, the youngest, a farm boy from Iowa who joined the army to see the world. He hadn't expected that world to be white, endless, and colder than his worst nightmares. Together they were a forgotten speck on the map, a handful of men watching the weather while the great powers tore each other apart thousands of miles away. Until one morning, the dogs began to bark. It was just after dawn when Erik stepped outside to check the traps. The horizon was clear, a flat expanse of ice and drifting snow. But the dogs had gone tense, their ears pricked, their eyes fixed eastward. He raised his binoculars and squinted. At first, there was nothing. Then faintly, like ghosts emerging from fog. Movement. Figures. At least 6, maybe more. They moved slowly, dragging something behind them. Erik's breath caught. He ran back to the cabin. "Lieutenant, you better come see this." Within moments, Carter was at the door, scanning the distance. "Could be a patrol," Marsh suggested. "In Greenland?" Carter shook his head. "No one patrols out here." "Maybe Danish trappers?" said Riley. Erik's tone was low. "Not trappers, no sleds, no dogs. Look how they walk. Formation. Military." The realization came like ice water. Carter lowered the binoculars. "Then we're not alone anymore." The outpost came alive. Marsh checked the radio, trying to raise base command in Iceland. The static hissed back. The line was weak, maybe damaged by the cold. Carter looked over the maps. "If they're Germans, this could be part of their weather network. We can't let them take our equipment." Riley loaded his rifle, hands shaking slightly. "What if they're lost?" "Then we help them," Carter said. "But we don't take chances." Erik and Lars went outside to set up a lookout post on a nearby ridge. The binoculars showed the figures moving closer, slower now, as if exhausted. "They're freezing," Lars said quietly. "You can see it in the way they fall." Erik frowned. "And yet they keep coming." By afternoon, the group was only a mile away. The weather had worsened, snow whipping sideways, cutting visibility. From the main hut, Carter could see shapes moving in the whiteout. He ordered everyone inside and dimmed the lights. The wind howled against the wooden walls like a living thing. Marsh spoke softly. "They'll freeze if we don't help." Carter didn't answer right away. He stared through the frosted window, trying to read the storm. His instincts screamed caution, but his conscience whispered something else. "Prepare blankets," he said finally. "If they reach us, we'll treat the wounded, but keep your rifles close." When the knock finally came, it was weak. Barely more than a scrape against the door. Carter motioned for everyone to hold position. He unlatched the door slowly and pulled it open. Snow burst inward, along with 2 men in torn coats, faces pale and frozen. Their lips were cracked, their eyes hollow. The first man collapsed at Carter's feet, whispering something in German. The other followed, clutching a pistol, but too weak to raise it. Carter kicked the weapon aside and shouted, "Get them inside, now!" The crew carried the men to the cot. Erik began rubbing their hands with warm cloths, while Marsh boiled water. Riley, wide-eyed, looked at their uniforms. "Lieutenant, they're Kriegsmarine." Carter stared down at the men, one young, one older, both wearing insignia of a German U-boat crew. "They came from the sea," Carter murmured. "But how?" Hours later, as the storm raged outside, one of the men stirred. His name, they learned, was Lieutenant Klaus Berger. He spoke English, slowly, painfully. "There, Was a submarine, he said between coughs. Ice crushed it. We walked for days, others behind us. How many? Asked Carter. 5, maybe 6. Our captain, Reiner, he leads them. Carter's jaw tightened. And where are they now? Berger's answer came like a whisper of doom. Coming here. Night fell heavy and long. The wind screamed through the cracks in the walls, and the temperature dropped below -30. Carter gathered his men by the lantern light. If what he says is true, there's a group of armed Germans headed this way. We don't know their condition or their intent. Marsh swallowed. Could be they just want shelter. Or our radio, Eric said grimly. If they send a message home, the next thing we'll see is a plane or a ship full of soldiers. Carter nodded. Then we prepare for both possibilities. No one fires unless fired upon, but if they try to take this station, we destroy the transmitter before they can use it. Riley looked pale. Sir, we can't fight soldiers with hunting rifles. Carter looked him in the eye. Then we'll fight with what we know, the ice. Outside, the storm eased just before dawn. In the eerie half-light of morning, the world was still again. On the ridge, Eric saw movement. 7 figures now, dark against the white. They were closer. He whispered into the small field radio, "They're here." Carter stood by the door, rifle in hand, heart steady. Inside the cabin, Berger lay on the cot, eyes open now, watching. He knew what was coming. So did Carter. Because in the war of machines and empires, this was something smaller, rawer, more human. A handful of freezing men about to fight for the right to live another day in a world made of ice. In March 17th, 1943, the Arctic silence was broken, not by war machines, but by footsteps in the snow. The morning began in a grey haze. The storm had passed, but the cold was sharper than ever. Frost glittered on the metal tower above Station Northlight, and the air carried a silence that felt almost holy. Inside the wooden hut, Lieutenant Samuel Carter and his crew prepared for the day. They spoke little, even the dogs seemed nervous, pacing and whining near the door. The 2 rescued Germans, Lt. Klausberger and the young engineer Hansen, lay wrapped in blankets near the stove. They had survived the night, barely. Their faces were pale, lips cracked, but their strength was returning. Carter stood by the window, looking toward the east. Somewhere beyond that horizon, more Germans were coming. He could feel it. Eric Jensen joined him, snow goggles hanging around his neck. "Tracks," he said quietly. "Fresh, maybe 2 kilometers out. Coming this way." Carter nodded slowly. "How many?" 5, maybe 6. They move like soldiers, but slower. Tired. Carter turned to Marsh. "Radio still down?" Marsh sighed. "Still just static, sir. The antenna froze solid in the storm. I'll try again after sunrise." Carter's hand tightened around his cup of coffee. "We're on our own then." Outside, the light was weak and ghostly, the sun barely visible behind the fog. The world was endless white. Eric and Lars took positions on the ridge with their hunting rifles, hidden behind chunks of ice. Through binoculars, Eric spotted movement, small, dark shapes in the distance. The Germans were coming. They looked exhausted. Their clothes were stiff with frost, faces hollow, steps uneven. At their head walked Kapitänleutnant Franz Reiner, tall and gaunt, his eyes fixed ahead. Every movement was driven by willpower alone. Behind him, 2 men dragged a sled carrying their last supplies. The others clutched rifles, though their fingers trembled from the cold. Reiner paused and lifted his binoculars. Through the haze, he could see the faint shape of buildings. A radio mast, Wooden roofs, smoke from a stove. Life. He lowered the glasses and said, "There, that must be it." Berta's last words echoed in his mind. "The Americans are there, sir. Maybe they'll help." But deep down, Rainer knew mercy was rare in war. At the station, Carter gathered his crew inside the main hut. "All right, listen up. If they reach us, we hold position here. No shooting unless necessary. They may just want food or shelter." Riley shifted nervously. "And if they don't?" "Then we use the terrain," Carter replied. "They're soldiers. We're survivors. We know this land better than they do." Eric nodded grimly. "The ice will fight on our side." They prepared quietly. Weapons were checked. 3 rifles, 2 pistols, and a single hunting shotgun. Hardly enough to repel trained soldiers, but it would have to do. Carter looked to Berger, who sat weakly on his cot. "You said your captain's coming here? What does he want?" Berger hesitated. "Supplies, shelter, maybe a radio." Carter frowned. "To contact Germany?" Berger didn't answer. His silence said enough. Carter sighed. "If they try to take our radio, we destroy it. Understood?" Everyone nodded. By midday, the Germans were close. Eric watched through binoculars as they crossed the frozen plain below. The wind carried every sound, the crunch of snow, the click of metal. He whispered into the field mic. "They're spreading out now, 2 moving to flank right." Carter answered quietly, "Hold your fire." The men inside the cabin waited in tense silence. Riley's hands trembled as he gripped his rifle. Marsh checked the radio again, praying for a signal, but all he heard was the endless hiss of static. Then Yishtach, a shout in German. "Hello, Americans, we come in peace." The voice echoed across the ice. Carter looked at Eric, who nodded slowly from the ridge. "They're waving a white cloth, sir?" Carter stepped outside, snow crunching beneath his boots. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, but his hand stayed near it. The German captain stood 50 feet away, his men behind him. His face was worn but proud. "I am Kapitän Leutnant Franz Rainer of the Kriegsmarine," he called. "We mean no harm. Our submarine is lost. We only seek shelter." Carter's voice was steady. "You're on Allied territory. You'll surrender your weapons and then we'll talk." Rainer hesitated. He looked at his men, half frozen, starving, and nodded. One by one they placed their rifles on the snow. Carter gestured toward the station. "Come forward, slowly." Inside the cabin, the air grew heavy as the Germans entered. Marsh and Riley watched nervously as Carter closed the door behind them. The room filled with the smell of cold air and unwashed clothes. Carter spoke first. "You can stay here until the storm clears. After that, we'll figure out transport to Iceland." Rainer nodded. "We appreciate it, Lieutenant." For a few hours, there was uneasy peace. The Germans rested, ate what little food was offered, and thawed their hands by the stove. But beneath the calm, tension simmered. Rainer's eyes kept drifting to the radio transmitter. Berger noticed and whispered, "Sir, don't." Rainer's reply was low, almost bitter. "Without that radio, we're already dead." That night, while the others slept, Rainer moved quietly toward the equipment table. The lanterns burned low, casting long shadows. He touched the radio's metal casing, frost-cold beneath his glove. His fingers trembled as he reached for the switch. Then, a soft click behind him. "Step away from it," came Carter's voice. Rainer froze. He turned slowly. Carter stood in the doorway, rifle aimed, eyes steady. "Don't make me do this," Carter said. Rainer's jaw tightened. "We need to call for rescue. My men are dying." "You call for rescue," Carter said quietly. "And you bring death to all of us. Planes, submarines. This outpost will burn." The two men stared at each other across the dim cabin. Soldiers from opposite sides of the world, both frozen, both tired of killing. Finally, Reiner lowered his hand. "You think this war will spare you, Lieutenant? It reaches everywhere, even here." Carter didn't answer. He simply said, "Go back to your cot." Reiner turned and walked away. Carter watched him go, the weight of command pressing heavy on his shoulders. He knew this fragile truce wouldn't last. Outside, the wind began to rise again, whispering through the cracks in the walls. In the distance, something cracked. Not ice this time, but gunfire. Eric's voice came through the field radio, urgent. "Lieutenant! Movement North Ridge! Someone's out there! More men!" Carter's blood ran cold. "What do you see?" "2 figures, maybe 3. Armed, not ours." Carter's gaze flicked to Reiner, who was already standing, alarmed. "Who are they?" Carter demanded. Reiner's face turned pale. "They're not mine. We left no one behind." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then another sound cut through the storm, a distant explosion, muffled but clear. The ice itself trembled. Carter's hand went to his rifle. "Everyone take cover! Whatever's coming, it's not over yet!" Outside, in the white wilderness, figures moved like shadows. Hunters or hunted, no one could yet tell. But in that endless frozen land, one truth remained. The war had found them all. In March 19th, 1943, the storm returned, but this time the wind carried gunfire. Night came early in the Arctic, falling like a curtain over the endless white. The snow shimmered faintly under a dim moon, and the air was heavy with the sound of the wind whispering across the ice. But beneath that wind came something new, echoes sharp and distant, the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Inside Station Northlight, Lieutenant Samuel Carter stood at the window, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the dark horizon. The thin glass rattled with each gust of wind. Eric Jensen's voice came through the field radio, broken by static. "They're close, maybe half a mile north. 3, possibly 4 figures. Moving fast. Not Germans, not ours either." Carter's brow furrowed. "Then who?" Before Eric could answer, a shot whistled past the antenna tower and struck the snow near the cabin. The sound split the night. Carter ducked. "Down! Everyone down!" Inside, chaos erupted. Marsh threw himself over the radio equipment. Riley hit the floor, and the dogs began barking wildly. The German officer Franz Reiner grabbed his weapon from the corner, instinctively taking cover by the wall. Carter swung toward him, rifle raised. "Put it down." Reiner's face was stone. "You'll need every gun you have, Lieutenant. Whoever's out there, they're not here to talk." Carter hesitated, then gave a short nod. "Fine, but you follow my orders, or you're the first one outside." Reiner nodded once. "Understood." Outside, the storm thickened, snow swirling so dense it looked like smoke. Eric and Lars Jensen were still hidden on the ridge, watching through their scopes. "Who are they?" Lars whispered. Eric exhaled slowly. "I don't know, but they move like hunters, not soldiers." The figures below crept between mounds of ice, using the wind as cover. One carried a rifle slung over his back, another dragged a small sled. Their faces were wrapped in furs, their movements slow and deliberate. Then Eric's breath caught. "Wait, read that flag, that's Danish." Lars frowned. "Ours?" "Maybe, or maybe not." Before they could signal the station, one of the figures raised his weapon and fired toward the outpost again. Inside the cabin, the bullet shattered the corner of a window. Riley cried out and hit the floor. "They're shooting at the tower!" Marsh shouted. "They're trying to cut our radio link!" Carter ran to the wall, pulled down the emergency flare gun, and fired it through the roof hatch. The red light exploded over the station, illuminating the snow like blood against white. For a brief second, they saw them clearly. 3 men crawling low across the ice, wearing mismatched coats and carrying old hunting rifles. Carter blinked. "They're not soldiers." Reiner stepped beside him, eyes narrowing. "No, they're scavengers." "Scavengers." "Locals, maybe hunters, but war changes men. They've learned to kill whoever has food, fuel, or warmth." Carter's jaw clenched. "And we have all 3. For hours, the firefight stayed distant, sporadic shots echoing through the storm. The outpost was low on ammunition, and no one dared waste a bullet. In the dim light of the lantern, Carter gathered everyone around the map table. "We're surrounded by ice on 3 sides. They're camped north, probably using an old hunting shelter. If they block the ridge, we can't escape." Reiner pointed to the coast on the map. "There's an inlet here, maybe 10 kilometers away. If we can reach it, we can follow the ice to open sea. My men can signal any passing U-boat or ship." Carter glared. "We're not calling the Kriegsmarine." Reiner's tone was cold. "Then you'll die here?" Before Carter could reply, Eric's voice came through the radio again, tense and broken. "Lieutenant, they're moving. West side now, 3 of them, and wait." A loud crash followed. Static. Then silence. Carter's heart dropped. "Eric? Eric, do you read?" No response. Only the wind. Minutes later, a muffled explosion shook the cabin. The stove rattled, lanterns swung. Riley yelled, "They hit the fuel cache!" Carter bolted to the window. Outside, orange light flickered across the snow. One of the supply sheds was burning, its flame clawing up into the dark. "Get the extinguishers!" he shouted. Reiner and Marsh rushed out into the storm, fighting through the wind. The flames roared, smoke billowing upward. The heat felt unreal in that frozen world. Together they kicked snow onto the fire, coughing through the fumes until only blackened metal remained. By the time they returned inside, their faces were ash-streaked and pale. Reiner leaned against the wall, breathing hard. "They know where we are now. They won't stop until they have everything." Carter sat at the table, head in hands. The outpost was no longer a weather station. It was a target. Hours passed. The storm howled, sometimes so loud it drowned out thought itself. Marsh finally managed to fix the antenna with Lars's help. Static filled the cabin. Then faintly, just faintly, a voice broke through. "Northlight Station, this is Allied Command Iceland. Respond." Marsh nearly cried out. "We've got them, sir! We've got them!" Carter grabbed the mic. "This is Lieutenant Carter, Northlight Station. We are under attack. Repeat, under attack. Unknown hostiles in the area and German survivors present. Request immediate extraction." The signal crackled, faint and uncertain. "Acknowledged. Hold position. Extraction delayed by weather." Then silence again. Carter dropped the mic slowly. "Help's coming, but not soon." Reiner looked toward the door. "Then we hold the line." As the night deepened, they fortified the cabin, barrels at the doors, snow piled against the windows, rifles checked and reloaded. The wind outside roared like a living thing, and beneath it, faintly, came the sound of movement. Footsteps. Riley's hands trembled as he peered through the narrow slit of the window. "They're close, sir. Maybe 20 meters." Carter took a deep breath. No lights, no noise. The moment stretched long, every second a heartbeat. Then a shadow moved past the door. Another followed. The handle turned. Riley's finger twitched near the trigger. Then came a loud bang, metal hitting wood, and a shout in Danish. "Eric! It's Eric!" Carter rushed forward, pulling the door open. Eric Jensen stumbled inside, bleeding from his arm, frost on his beard. "They took Lars," he gasped. "Dragged him north, said they'd trade him for supplies." Carter steadied him. "You're sure they're not soldiers?" Eric shook his head. "No uniforms, just hunger." The weight of his words filled the room like cold fog. Reiner stood slowly, his expression unreadable. "Lieutenant, I've fought many wars. Hunger makes men worse than soldiers. You can't negotiate with it." Carter looked around the room. His exhausted men, the wounded, the flickering light. He knew Reiner was right, but he also knew they couldn't abandon Lars. He picked up his rifle and said quietly, "We go at dawn." Eric nodded weakly. "It'll be suicide." "Maybe," Carter replied, "but better than dying waiting for ghosts." Outside, the wind began to rise again, swirling snow over the frozen plain. The world was quiet, but in that quiet, death was moving closer. One footstep, one breath, one shot at a time. And as the first light of morning crept over the horizon, it revealed not peace, but a landscape waiting for war. In March 20th, 1943, the Arctic sun rose weakly over a battlefield of snow, and for some, it would be the last sunrise they ever saw. The morning came pale and cold, the kind of cold that could shatter bone and turn breath into frost within seconds. The wind had eased, but silence was heavier than the storm. The men of Station Northlight stood ready, their eyes hollow, their bodies weary. They had barely slept. Lieutenant Samuel Carter pulled on his fur-lined coat, tightening the strap of his rifle. Across from him, Eric Jensen sat by the stove, his arm bandaged, staring into the last ember of flame. Outside, the Arctic plains stretched endlessly. The tracks in the snow, half buried by the wind, led north, toward the scavengers, toward Lars, who had been taken in the night. "3 hostiles," Eric said quietly. "Maybe 4. They have Lars, and they'll use him to draw us out." Carter nodded. "We'll move fast. No fire unless we must." From the corner, Franz Reiner, the German officer, checked his sidearm. "You'll need me," he said simply. Carter's eyes flicked toward him. "We'll see." Reiner met his gaze without flinching. "Lieutenant, I've crossed half the world fighting in snow like this. You'll need someone who understands desperation." Carter said nothing for a long moment, then handed him a spare rifle. "One chance, Reiner. You pull anything and I'll end it myself." Reiner gave a small nod. "Fair." By the time they left the station, the light had turned sharp and metallic. The wind had carved strange shapes into the ice, ridges like frozen waves. Each step crunched softly, echoing across the emptiness. They moved in a line, Carter in front, Reiner beside him, Eric trailing close, and young Riley bringing up the rear. After 2 miles, they found signs of camp, a torn tarp half buried in snow, scraps of seal meat frozen solid, and a single boot print leading farther north. Carter knelt beside it. "They're close." Reiner crouched beside him, brushing away ice. "And they're starving. Look at the stride, unsteady, dragging the left leg." Eric raised his rifle. "Then maybe they're desperate enough to listen." Reiner's voice was flat. "Desperation doesn't listen, it takes." By midday, clouds had gathered again, turning the light flat and grey, the horizon blurred, sky and ground melting into one pale colour. Then Eric saw it, a flicker of movement near a ridge of ice. "Up there," he whispered. They crouched behind a drift, peering through the scopes. At the top of the ridge, 2 figures huddled beside a small fire, smoke barely rising. Between them, tied at the wrists, sat Lars Jensen, alive but pale, his face raw from the wind. Carter's jaw clenched. "We take them from both sides. Eric, circle east with Riley. Reiner and I go west." Eric hesitated. "If this goes wrong, it won't," Carter said, though he didn't believe it. The snow muffled every sound as they crept forward, the ice beneath them groaning softly. Carter's fingers were numb, but his mind was sharp. Every detail stood out, the smoke curling in the air, the soft hiss of the wind, the faint crackle of the fire. Then a sudden voice rang out from the ridge. "Stop! Don't move!" One of the scavengers stood, rifle aimed straight toward Carter. Before Carter could react, a second figure grabbed Lars by the neck and dragged him closer to the fire. "Drop your guns or he dies!" Reiner froze beside him. "They've seen us." Carter's pulse pounded in his ears. He could see the man's face now, thin, frostbitten, eyes wild. He wasn't a soldier. He was a man who had seen too much winter. Carter raised his voice. "We don't want to fight. Let the prisoner go and we'll give you supplies. Food, medicine." The man's laughter was harsh. "You think that keeps us alive out here? We need your warmth, your walls, your fire." Carter's hand tightened on the trigger. "You can't survive this far north without help. We can work together." "Work together?" the man spat. "You and your soldiers burned the coast. You left us nothing." Reiner stiffened. Carter shot him a warning glance, but it was too late. The German had stepped forward. "Those weren't my men," Reiner said in a calm voice. "But I know what it means to lose everything. If you kill him, you'll die out here too." The man hesitated, his rifle trembling. For a second there was silence. Then a single shot cracked through the air. The scavenger fell. Riley had fired from the ridge. Chaos exploded. The other scavenger screamed and opened fire. Bullets tore through the snow. Eric shouted for Lars to duck and fired back, his shot echoing like thunder. Reiner charged forward, dragging Carter with him. They slid behind an ice ridge, snow exploding around them. "Cover me!" Reiner shouted. Carter raised his rifle and fired twice, forcing the last scavenger to drop his weapon and crawl behind a rock. Reiner moved fast, crossing the open ground toward Lars. Bullets snapped past him, one grazing his shoulder, but he didn't stop. He grabbed Lars by the arm and pulled him down the slope. Carter's world narrowed to the sound of the wind and the pounding of his heart. He fired again. The scavenger fell, motionless. Then all was silent. Minutes later, they gathered beside the dying fire. Lars shivered violently, eyes half open. Eric wrapped him in a blanket, whispering something in Danish that sounded like a prayer. Carter looked at Reiner, who was bleeding from his shoulder. "You didn't have to go back for him." Reiner gave a faint smile. "I told you. I understand desperation." Carter nodded slowly. "Maybe you do." They made it back to Northlight by evening. The wind had risen again, but faintly they could hear something over it, a distant hum. Riley pointed toward the horizon. "Sir, do you hear that?" Carter stepped outside, squinting through the snow. A dark shape was descending through the clouds, a plane. "Rescue," he whispered. The Allied extraction had finally come. They lit flares, sending orange light up into the grey sky. The aircraft circled once, then again, and began to descend near the coast. For the first time in weeks, Carter felt the weight begin to lift. As they prepared to leave, he walked to the frozen shore one last time. The sea stretched endlessly, grey, silent, and vast. Behind him, Reiner stood watching. "So this is how it ends," Reiner said quietly. Carter turned to face him. "You'll be taken in, as a prisoner." Reiner nodded. "Better than dying in the ice?" He extended his hand. Carter hesitated, then shook it. "War turns men into enemies," Carter said. "But out here, it just turns them into survivors." Reiner gave a faint smile. Until the next storm. Hours later, as the plane lifted off, the Arctic world shrank beneath them, white fields, black rocks, and the tiny speck that had been Northlight Station. Eric stared out the window, whispering, "All that for weather reports." Carter didn't answer. He was thinking of the faces, Lars, Marsh, Riley, Reiner, and of all the frozen miles between life and death. The sun broke through the clouds, faint and cold, reflecting on the endless ice. For a brief moment, the world looked peaceful again, but the war below still raged far beyond the snow, and men still fought and froze and fell in places no one would ever remember. And somewhere beneath the ice, the wind carried the last echo of a battle fought not for victory, but for survival.